Russian President Vladimir Putin secured his fifth term as president this weekend after a so-called election. Putin will now reign for 6 more years, making him the longest-serving Russian leader since Joseph Stalin. The win also comes just 1 month after the death of opposition leader and political prisoner Alexei Navalny. Navalny died in a Russian penal colony, and Western leaders blame Putin squarely for his death. In the final years of his life, Navalny saw this weekend's so-called election as an opportunity for Russians to voice their dissent. One woman who also knows that fight is Evgenia Kara-Murza. Her husband, Vladimir, is an opposition politician who has been held prisoner since 2022. With Navalny dead, Vladimir is now Russia's most high-profile political prisoner, and his wife, Evgenia, is with us now. Hi, Mrs. Kara-Murza. Thank you so much for making time for this.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
The world is watching right now these so-called elections take place, and Putin, of course, assume a 5th term. What is going through your mind as you watch that unfold?
Well, I see people pouring ink and paint in ballot boxes. I see other people throwing Molotov cocktails at polling stations. And I realize that whatever the measures the regime is using to create this warped image of universal support for Vladimir Putin and for his war in Ukraine has nothing to do with reality. You know, whatever measures he's using, people are trying to find ways to say no to his regime and to say no to the war. And this makes me proud of these Russian people.
What can you convey to Canadians about the level, your sense of the level of opposition to Putin in Russia? The images we get are largely through state media, of course, controlled by him and the Kremlin. Your husband and yourself, so vocal in advocating for opposition to him. What is your sense among the Russian people of their support for that opposition?
Well, the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners in Russia, and the fact that the arrests and detentions are happening on a daily basis and have not stopped since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine had broken out 2 years ago, shows that there is, of course, opposition, not in the political sense opposition, because every single candidate that could show competition to Vladimir Putin has either been forced out of the country or killed, like Boris Nemtsov in 2015, like Alexei Navalny just a couple of weeks ago. Vladimir Putin is very afraid of competition, and so yes, he eliminates every possibility of a competition to him during so-called elections and in the daily life as well. But ordinary Russians continue opposing what is happening, even when they use some underground method of doing that, or by pouring ink and paint in ballot boxes nowadays. And I believe that the fact that repression is so harsh and so wide-scale also shows that the regime indeed sees these people showing opposition as existential threat to them in the Kremlin. For as long as Vladimir Putin is allowed to remain in the Kremlin, warmongering will continue, repression in the country will continue, and we need to do everything we can to bring closer the day when the war ends and when the regime in the Kremlin collapses.
In your view, what is the most important thing the West can do to counter exactly what you just spelled out is happening in Russia and happening vis-a-vis Putin? And I ask against the backdrop of, I remember interviewing you a few years ago when you were in Ottawa. You meet with foreign ministers from right across the Western allies. Like, what is your primary message to them about what has to happen now in order to put an end, essentially, to what you have just described?
Well, the process that is taking place today in Russia, over these 3 days in Russia, cannot be called an election. This is a travesty. This has nothing to do with a process that is called election in any democracy. Vladimir Putin is yet again usurping power in the country for the 5th time. He's been in power for a quarter of a century and has never actually won any election without widespread fraud. So what the free world could do today is actually calling a spade a spade. Vladimir Putin is not a legitimate leader of the Russian Federation. He is a usurper and a dictator, like my husband recently wrote in an op-ed for the Washington Post. And it is time the free world finally said so.
Just before I let you go, Mrs. Kara-Murza, I do want to ask about your husband, whom I also had the honor of interviewing on a number of occasions. Do you have communication with him, and what can you share about his well-being at this moment?
Vladimir has been in solitary confinement of a punishment cell since last September. He is currently held in a so-called special regime prison colony, which is the harshest grade in the Russian penitentiary system. He's held in a tiny cell where the bed is fixed to the wall from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. He has only a backless stool as the only piece of furniture in that cell. He's allowed an hour and a half of reading and writing a day, an hour and a half of walk in a small courtyard where he does not get to see any other prisoners. So he's basically by himself all the time. And despite all of that, he continues using every single opportunity to address the audience, to address the Russian population, to address Western leaders. And he is just as strong as he's always been.
I'll leave it on that note. Mrs. Kara-Murza, thank you very much for sharing some of your time today with us.